Alright, so this is the last dissection video for the pig. So last week we went over the different structures in the throat region, in the mouth, as well as parts of the digestive tract and the liver. So this week we'll be going over the circulatory system as well as the urogenital system. So I'll start off with the circulatory system. So if you remember from last week, the arteries are dyed red and the veins are dyed a blue color. So all these veins and arteries are stemming from one central location, which is this muscle right here, which is the heart. So that heart is a four-chambered heart. All crocodiles, alligators, birds, mammals will have this same general layout of a four-chambered heart. So that heart is going to be broken up into two atria and two ventricles. So you have a right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle, and a left atria. So that's not the order that blood's going to be flowing through this heart though. So the way blood flows through this heart is that blood's going to be flowing through this vein called the posterior vena cava, anterior vena cava. So you have the anterior vena cava, blood's going to be flowing into that right atrium. It's then going to be passing through a series of valves where it's going to enter the right ventricle. From here, it's exiting the heart through this structure right here, which is the pulmonary artery. So that pulmonary artery is going to be carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart and into the lungs. So that pulmonary artery will break off into it'll break off into two separate arteries, a left pulmonary and a right pulmonary, and it will connect to each of the lungs, carrying that deoxygenated blood to the lungs, where that blood can then be oxygenated. It will release CO2, absorb oxygen. That blood is then pumped back into the heart, into this structure here, the left atrium, through what we call the pulmonary veins, which I can never find. But if we were to look closely at this, scrape away some of this tissue, it'd be right here. So that blood, once it's entered back into the heart, through that left atrium, it's going to be flowing down into the left ventricle, this structure right here, where it's then going to be exiting the heart and being pumped out to the rest of the body through what we call the dorsal aorta. So if we move the heart down a little bit, and right next to that anterior vena cava right here, you have this artery right here, and so that's the aortic arch. And so the aortic arch is broken off into really 5 different channels. So blood's either going to be flowing to the upper half of the body, or it's going to be flowing to the lower half of the body. So if it's going to be flowing through the upper half of the body, it's going to be broken off into 4 distinct arteries. So it's going to be broken off into 2 carotids and 2 subclavian arteries. So once again, you have a left and a right side for this pig. So the arteries that you see here, right here, this is the left subclavian artery, and then this is the right subclavian artery right here. And so these are going to be supplying the arms with blood, making sure that this pig has enough, that those legs have enough oxygen to function. The other 2 major arteries that blood can flow through in the upper half of the body is through what we call the carotids. So you have a right carotid right here. Move the pig down some. You have the right carotid right here, and then you have the left carotid on the other side of the throat. So those are going to be supplying the brain with blood. So once blood has reached its or released its oxygen, it's passed through the cells or the veins, the arteries and capillary beds that it's released oxygen at, it'll pass back through veins. And so the 2 major veins in the throat region that are where all the blood is draining from are the 2 jugulars. So you have right here, you have the right jugular, and on the other side of the neck you have the left jugular. For the arm, you have the 2 subclavian veins. So those are found right next to the subclavian artery. So you have a subclavian vein right here, So this one would be the right subclavian vein. And right here you have the left subclavian vein. So those are all going to be draining towards this anterior vena cava, where that blood is going to be re-entering the heart. So it's going to enter the right atrium, into the right ventricle, into the pulmonary artery, into the lungs. It's going to release that CO2, become oxygenated, come back into the left atrium right here, pump down into the left ventricle, where it's then going to exit out that dorsal aorta right here. So instead of going to the top half of the body, that blood can travel down through what we call the dorsal aorta. So that dorsal aorta is, well, the easiest way to see it is to really travel down the length of the body a bit farther. So this long white structure, if we move the colon out of the way, this is the dorsal aorta, and so this is going to be carrying blood to the back legs, the digestive system, reproductive system, basically anything that's just south of the heart. So one of the easiest arteries to find along this dorsal aorta is the renal arteries. So these are going to be supplying the kidneys with blood. So you have a kidney right here. That kidney is going to be collecting metabolic waste and then processing it before it can be transported to the bladder and expelled from the body. So that metabolic waste is being transported by this circulatory system into the kidneys via this renal artery right here. That blood is going to exit that kidney through this structure right here, which is going to be called the renal vein, and so that's going to be traveling to a different structure. So it's not going to be traveling to the dorsal aorta. Instead, it's going to be crossing over, which is what you see here, and it's going to be entering this structure, this blue structure, which is called the posterior vena cava. So that posterior vena cava is going to be running up the length of the body to basically the top of the heart, where it can then meet with that anterior vena cava right here. So if we continue to work our way down the length of the body, this dorsal aorta breaks off into a bunch of different arteries. So the first branch, or the largest branch that you can see, is these umbilical arteries right here and here. So these are going to be basically pumping blood to capillary beds that are in this umbilical cord so that it can gain nutrients from its mother while it's in the womb. The other branching structure that you see here is called the iliac artery. And so I'm going to pick up another pig because I have it fairly well dissected there. So in this pig, we have that iliac artery exposed. So right here, if we move some of this material out of the way, you have the dorsal aorta. So just to familiarize yourself with this pig, here's the dorsal aorta, here's the colon, kidneys, renal artery, renal vein, and then if we move everything out of the way, we have the posterior vena cava. So now you're somewhat familiar with this pig. You have the two umbilical cords, umbilical arteries here and here, and then you have that other branch from the dorsal aorta right here. And so from here to here, we have the iliac artery. That iliac artery is going to break off into separate arteries itself. And so the major one is this one right here. So this is called the femoral artery, and so this is going to branch off into each leg and supply those legs with enough oxygen. So blood's going to be flowing through veins, and these ones are fairly easy to remember because it's just the opposite of what the arteries are called. So you have the femoral artery that's going to be transporting blood into the leg. That blood's going to be flowing back through this structure, which is the femoral vein. That's going to be entering the iliac vein right here before it enters the posterior vena cava right here. The umbilical vein, or the umbilical arteries, are connected to the umbilical vein, which is not in this region. So when you were cutting off this umbilical cord, the umbilical artery is actually closer to the liver than it is to the dorsal aorta or anything else. So this structure right here is the umbilical vein, and so that's going to be connected to the posterior vena cava just beneath the liver. So all that blood is going to be flowing back up to the heart, where it's going to be connecting at that posterior vena cava in the back here. Well, I'm sorry, the anterior vena cava in the back. So if we look at just a plain heart, grab a if we look at just a plain heart here, you have the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium. And so those four chambers are kind of separated by this thin line right here. So this is called the coronary artery. And so the heart is a muscle and it's pumping lots of blood. It's very active. It needs a lot of oxygen in order to function. And so this coronary artery is going to be supplying this muscle with blood. So you have the main coronary artery, and that main coronary artery is broken off into two different sections. So if we flip that heart over, you have the right coronary artery, and then there's a left coronary artery that I can never find either. So here you have that pulmonary artery right here. So that's going to be exiting from that right ventricle. So blood's flowing from the right atrium to the right ventricle and then out to the lungs through this pulmonary artery. It's going to be entering what we call the left atrium, so this structure right here, through this tube right here, which is the pulmonary vein. So this is oxygenated blood. That's why this structure is dyed red. Once that blood is then pumped from the left atrium into the left ventricle, it's going to be exiting the heart through that aortic arch, which is this structure right here that's been cut open. This dark blue structure right here is where that the anterior vena cava or superior vena cava is attaching to that heart, and then blood's going to be entering the right atrium. So that's the circulatory system of a pig. So this is a fairly complex structure or system, but it's the most efficient way to pump oxygen throughout a very large volume of cells. So the next system that I'll talk about is the urogenital system. So I already kind of touched on this earlier when I was talking about the kidneys. So if we look at this pig here, it's going to have a left kidney and a right kidney. Those are going to be connected to the circulatory system through the renal artery and the renal vein right here and here respectively. So this kidney is going to be collecting metabolic waste, and that metabolic waste is going to be stored in this structure right here, and so this is called the urinary bladder. So I'm sure you can guess what it's going to be storing. It's going to be storing urine. So that metabolic waste is going to make its way from the kidney to the urinary bladder through this tube right here. So this tube is called a ureter, and everything on that urea is going to be traveling from the kidney through the ureter to the urinary bladder here. So this is a male pig. Female pigs will also have ureters and kidneys. There's no difference between the two of them. So if you look at a female pig, you have covered up by an arm. I'm trying to do this one-handed. You have the kidney. That ureter is right here, and that's going to be traveling to the urinary bladder here. So since I have a female pig up right now, I'm going to point out parts of the reproductive system. So females will have ovaries, and these ovaries are going to be producing eggs. So right here you have, right here you have an ovary. So it kind of looks like a really small knob that's attached to a series of tubes. So you have two ovaries. You have one ovary here, and you have one ovary here. Those ovaries are connected to this tube, which we call the oviduct. So eggs are going to be traveling from the ovary to the oviduct, and these two oviducts are going to meet at a single point, which we're going to call the uterine horn. So that structure, or this point where these two oviducts converge, is called the uterine horn, and that marks the very beginning of the uterus. So to see the uterus, we have to expose a little bit of the flesh that's surrounding the umbilical cord. And so there are these three vessels or tubes that are lying on top of each other. So you're going to have the colon or the rectum that's going to be lying dorsally. So right up against this pig's back, you'll have the uterus, and then you'll have the urethra. So right here you have the urethra. So this is connected to the urinary bladder. So this tube right here is the urethra. If we tear away some of this membrane, you have this tube right here, and this is the uterus. So this is going to be connected to those uterine horns and those oviducts right here. So urethra, uterus, and then just beneath those two vessels you have this third one right here, which is the large intestine. So that's a female reproductive system, at least the basics of a female reproductive system of a pig. A male pig is not going to have ovaries, it will have testes instead. So those testes are going to be producing sperm, which are going to be traveling down, well, technically up the length of the body, through what we call the seminal vesicle. So right here we have a testes, and so this is going to be held in this scrotal sac. So when you're determining the sex of your pig, and you're looking underneath the tail trying to sex it, if it has this enlarged region, that's the scrotal sac, and so that's where these testes are going to be held. If it's a female, it'll have that urogenital papillae that's just beneath the anus. So you have a testes right here. That testes is going to be connected to the other testes through this tube, which is the seminal vesicle right here. Each of these seminal vesicles, so here's one on the other side. I haven't exposed the other testes, but the other testes is going to be sitting right in this region here. So these two seminal vesicles are converging, and it looks rather similar to the uterine horn. And so where those two seminal vesicles connect, we have the vas deferens. So that vas deferens is going to be running down the length of the urinary bladder, where it's going to meet with the urethra. So this structure right here, this is the urethra, and that seminal vesicle, sorry, vas deferens is going to meet up with that urethra. So that's a male pig reproductive system in, I don't know, 3 minutes. I think that's what the time took. So, but yeah, that's a pig dissection. So the first video was going over circulatory system, digestive system, external anatomy, and a bit of the structures in the throat and the abdominal cavity. This video covered the last bit, which is just circulatory system and reproductive systems.